Latinx. This is a newer term I hear more and more often, and apparently it's replacing Latino/Hispanic. It's supposed to be a more inclusive term because Latino and Hispanic are not inclusive enough, so we needed a new term, Latinx. Full disclosure, I wasn't a big fan of the term Latinx before doing a ton of research for this video, and after doing a ton of research for the video, I'm even less of a fan of the term Latinx. Maybe I'm too old, maybe I'm not as liberal as I thought I once was. Regardless, we're gonna find out why. And also, yes, it is the middle of the day, I am drinking a margarita. Pro tip for you kids, instead of using ice, use frozen fruit. I'm using strawberries today. It doesn't water down your drink, and using fruit in there makes it a smoothie, so technically a health drink. Salud. We're gonna start off like any good scholar of a thing and define some terms. The most common terms for folks who come from or are descendants of people from Latin America are, of course, the terms Hispanic and Latino. Hispanic. This is a term that was coined by an assistant in the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, Grace Flores Hughes, back in the 1970s. Hispanic made its official debut in the 1980s census. Grace Flores Hughes stands by Hispanic as a unifying term. As she sees it, this term unites people by their Spanish last names. Flores Hughes is not a fan of the term Latino since it unites people by language. Since it unites people by language, it should then also include Portuguese and Italian people alongside people from Spanish-speaking descent. There's a common misconception that the term Hispanic came from corruption god and sweaty cabron Richard Nixon, but in fact is a term coined by Grace Flores Hughes. Flores Hughes contests that the term Hispanic is more inclusive to Hispanic Latino people in America. Latin would only apply to the people who were born in Latin America and not the people who were born here in the good old US of A. Flores Hughes is disappointed that the term became politicized. Democrats are more likely to use the term Latino, and Republicans are more likely to use the term Hispanic. Very ironic, as Grace Flores Hughes intended this term to be a unifying, neutral term, not a political one. Hispanic is a gender-neutral term, unlike Latino, which apparently is gendered. Latino. I'm going to use a definition in my research by a professor named Dr. Dario Fernandez Morera. Latino originally referred to the ancient Latinum people of Italy, who spoke, you guessed it, Latin, making ancient Romans the initial Latinos. Latin, as you may or may not know, was also the original Romance language. All the languages that derive from Latin are French, Spanish, Italian, Portuguese, and Romanian. Romanian? Is that right? Yes, Romanian. Kind of crazy, I know. So, all the folks from France, Spain, Portugal, Italy, and Romania are technically Latinos. The term Latino is also used in a film studies context. Hey, that's what my degree's in! Most notably to refer to Latin lover tropes in TV, movies, and other media. And yes, this is still very much a trope that is used today. In 1997, Latino was added to Hispanic in official government paperwork. Both Latino and Hispanic are used for people who are Spanish speakers, come from a Spanish-speaking household, and or have some kind of Spanish heritage ancestry. For many people, myself included, Hispanic reminds us too much of Spain. It's in the name, Hispanic. And you know Spain, that place where all the colonizing and genocide came from? Do not associate us with those people. Even though I'm pretty sure if I did one of those ancestry tests, because my mom and a couple of her siblings can pass for white, I discover that I have more European than native Mexican blood flowing through this janky body, but I still stand by my point. Do not associate me with them. Also, Latino in academia is used in a group studies context. context. What was once Chicano studies has morphed into Latino studies to be as inclusive as possible. Latino is viewed as a gendered term, and because it is gendered, it is seen as not inclusive. We'll get back to that. In terms of inclusivity, these two terms try to include as many people as humanly possible. There is one rather big problem with both of these terms. They're extremely Eurocentric. What is Eurocentric? Merriam-Webster Dictionary defines Eurocentric centered on Europe or the Europeans, especially reflecting a tendency to interpret the world in terms of European or Anglo-American values and experiences. Latino, Latinx, and Hispanic only recognize one side of our heritage, the more important European side. They fully ignore the less important Native side. It adds to the narrative. Native folks aren't worth mentioning because they didn't really do anything of note. Right. And lucky for them, the Europeans came and civilized the Native folks. Right. The actual terms Latin and Latin America were coined by French intellectual Michael Chevalier in the 1800s. Chevalier? French is super pretentious Spanish. This margarita was a mistake. Latin was something Chevalier thought was cute to call 1.5 continents of colonized people and land in this side of the world. Latin was a generic term to see if Mexico would embrace the French and let Napoleon III exploit them. Mexican elites liked this term because they thought Mexicans, in particular Native Mexicans, could be whitewashed into improvement. Again, the indigenous side, the colonized side, the term Latino, much like the term Hispanic, is another piece in the Eurocentric political war. Let me define two more terms that do celebrate the native sides of two groups of people on each coast of the United States: Chicano and Boricua. Chicano. No one is really sure where this term came from. Some folks believe that the term is a version of the Nahuatl word for the Mexica people. Others think it's just a variation of Mexicano. This term is specific to Mexican Americans, so this one would include me. Boricua. This term is specific to mi pana de Puerto Rico. The native people of Puerto Rico were the Taino, and they call their island Borican. People from or of Puerto Rican descent acknowledge their Taino roots and refer to themselves as Boricua. Both of these terms celebrate the native heritage, but are specific only to two groups of people. Outside of legal government stuff, they're not really a problem. Another thing to keep in mind is that all of these terms are specific to America. If you go elsewhere in the world and you ask people how they identify, they're just gonna tell you their nationality. Duh, right? If you go to Peru and you ask someone there how they identify, they're not gonna say Latino or Hispanic, they're gonna say they're Peruano. Like, yeah. Here in the US of A, since it is simultaneously a melting pot but super pinche racist, we have to lump people together by one or two commonalities. Some advice from me to you: stick to the terms Latino or Hispanic. Calling someone the wrong nationality might get you cussed out and might even get you stabbed. So stay safe out there. Okay, so let's talk about the actual Latinx term. Spoiler alert, this term is also super problematic and some might say imperialistic. Latinx, as defined by Merriam-Webster Dictionary, of, relating to, or marked by Latin American heritage, used as a gender-neutral alternative to Latino or Latina. Spanish, like most all other Latin-based languages, is gendered. It just is. This isn't me making it political or controversial. Spanish is a gendered language. That's just how it goes. I'm not saying we shouldn't be inclusive to non-binary or gender non-conforming people, because we totally should be. It is beyond necessary to be inclusive. However, changing a Spanish term and forcing it to abide by English-speaking rules just so a bunch of people will get the false sense that simply using the term Latinx is automatically doing good in the world and therefore you feel better about yourself is wrong. You're forcing rules onto a language and a people that it doesn't fit with just to make a couple of other people feel better. And I don't mean the non-binary or the gender non-conforming people. I mean the liberal people who like to pat themselves on the back for being inclusive when they don't do simple things like activism or going out to vote. These are the people I'm talking about. Which is weird because American English is famous for adopting and taking terms from around the world into its own lexicon. This Latinx term is essentially turning it into a Spanglish term. Nos vamos en la troca, a la marqueta, búscame un parqueadero. Spanglish, it's not a thing. I'm sorry, but no. Latino is already an inclusive term. Hispanic is already an inclusive term. When I say Latino, I could be referring to a bunch of Latin men, or I could be referring to a bunch of Latin people. It's already inclusive. But Latinos are famously machista and aren't inclusive to the LGBTQIA community. People from Latin America are only now being inclusive to the LGBTQIA community. Latinx is the most inclusive thing. Latinos have been inclusive in the history of inclusivity, I hear you say. Well, hold on to your nalgas while we learn a little bit about Latinos and the LGBTQIA community. You might falsely think lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgendered, queer, questioning, intersex, asexual inclusion and acceptance in the Hispanic Latino community is something new and recent. Not so fast. The ancient indigenous cultures of Latin America were, and still very much are, inclusive and tolerant of so-called alternative lifestyles. There are not very many records of this inclusivity or how inclusive they were because colonialization, but we do have some writings and some traditions to go on. The Aztecs were famously very intolerant, and that makes sense. A culture that was all about warfare and conquest, being disgusted at anything seen as less than alpha male is to be expected. Other ancient cultures like the Maya, Toltec, Itza, Inca, and Zapotecs were very cool with the gays and had reverence for people of a third gender. These third gender people were and still are important with rituals, traditions, and spiritual events. Then the Spanish came and messed everything up. Thanks for that. I'd like to highlight two amazing cases of tolerance and acceptance from a culture that from a Western standpoint is still backwards and very much retrograde. The Zapotec and the Muxe. Oaxaca was and still is mostly Zapotec. The Zapotec have the tradition of the dual spirit and third gender people. Most famously, the Muxe tradition. Muxe comes from the Spanish word for woman, mujer. The Muxe are men who dress and behave like women. There are Muxe vestidas, they only wear women's clothing, and there are Muxe pintadas. They dress and wear makeup like women. They are not characterized as men in drag or transgendered. They are considered a third gender. And they're free to live their lives how they see fit and face little to no discrimination. It is only when they encounter Western people that problems arise. The Muxe have relationships and get married to both men and women. The Zapotec don't seem to be preoccupied with labels or making people fit into pre-assigned boxes. Some Muxe are transgendered and do have gender reassignment surgery, but most don't. Since they're from an accepting culture, there are less instances of dysphoria and depression than folks in more Western societies have. Cuba and Resolución 126. I'm not going to go into Cuba, its politics, or its homophobia. We're not doing that in this video. We are going to talk about this one thing that Cuba does, and I think is great, and I think everywhere they should be doing it, especially here in the United States. In 1979, Cuba's public health directors decided to provide care and medical attention specialized for transgendered people. Then in 2008, Cuba passed Resolución 126, which made gender reassignment surgery free, covered under public health care. Cuba treats this issue as it should be treated, as a medical condition. It's between a person and a medical professional if that's the route they want to go through. Everyone else needs to step off. We totally should adopt that kind of thing here in America. And while we're at it, let's include a woman's autonomy thing fine too. Gracias. So, what's wrong with the term Latino then? As established, a lot is wrong with that term, but for the sake of this argument, let's explore further. The term Latino is already inclusive. Yes, Spanish is gendered, but it's not literal. If I look at my arm and I tell you this is el brazo, that doesn't mean that my arm is a man. It's a part of me. I am a straight cis woman. And before anyone comments on it, yes, I was born a woman. I identify as a woman too. Me being una mujer, I do not consider el brazo being un hombre. Now, in this Latinx logic, I would have to, instead of saying los brazos, I'd have to say los bracex. That makes absolutely no sense, and again, it's silly to force that kind of a rule on a language that was not built for that kind of a rule. This gendered language thing gets more complicated the more you look into it. This is la mano. By strict gendered language rules, la is reserved for things that are female, and anything that ends in o would be male. Like, it should be el mano or la mana. But that's not how that works. La mano combines both of these things, proving that even though Spanish is a gendered language, it's not literal. It's not as binary as some people would lead you to believe it is. So saying things like Latino, Mexicano, Cubano, Argentino, Peruano, etc. isn't exclusionary. These are terms that are built to be inclusive. Now, am I saying that you should never, ever use the term Latinx? No, of course not. If you're a person who is liberal and wants to express how much you're loving and inclusive of everybody, and you want to continue to use the term Latinx, go right ahead. That's great. I want everyone to be as inclusive and loving as possible. It's a great thing to be, and that's a great thing to do. It is important now, maybe more than ever. But if you're a white person who feels the need to correct a Latin person on using the terms Latino, Latina, or Latinx, you can kiss the fattest part of my nalgas. Educate yourself and let people decide what term they prefer. After all of that, what's the term that I prefer the most? I say Latin. I know it's technically a dead language and still very, very much Eurocentric, but I see it as inclusive and not political, so that's the term I prefer. I doubt that there will ever be one perfect term that everyone can agree on. And that's what happens when you choose one or two things to group together a whole mess of people that are super diverse and span a bunch of countries and a bunch of land and a bunch of cultures and a bunch of backgrounds and a bunch of everything. It's just not going to work for everybody. Although I do appreciate the spirit of trying to incorporate and include as many people as possible and bring us all together. Latinx was supposed to be that perfect all-inclusive term to make everybody happy, and here I have been for the last 2 hours crapping all over it. So when you're out there in the world and you're not sure what term is appropriate, you can always ask. There's absolutely nothing wrong with asking. It'll be fine. You'll find that Latin people are quite friendly and might teach you a cuss word as a bonding experience. We like to do that. May I request that the terms Hispanic, Latino, Latinx, etc. only be used in government paperwork, in data collection, in school paperwork, in journalism, that kind of thing? These are not terms that we need in our everyday lives. As a Latin person, I can tell you it is exhausting to constantly be asked, so, what are you? And then have that followed up with something mildly racist or sexist or both. You liking hot sauce and constantly offering me some does not make you woke or culturally sensitive. I'd like to be seen as what I am, an American. I was born here, I was raised here, I still live here, and as long as they don't repeal that 14th Amendment, I will die here as an American. I'm not denying my culture or heritage, not even a little bit. I'm ashamed my Spanish is so bad, and I know next to nothing about my native Mexican roots. This whole channel is about learning that side of me. I'm super proud and lucky to have such badass diversity, but declaring myself a Latina in my everyday life has so many connotations and baggage and stereotypes attached to it, I would rather not. Far from unifying unifying us. It separates me from the country I call home. I'm requesting to be seen as an American because that's what I am, and I want to not be othered in my everyday life. Not to be side-eyed when I'm in a fancier part of Los Angeles. Not to be ignored or looked at in a fancy restaurant by people who are wondering why I'm not in the back washing dishes. Not to be stereotyped by people who are shocked that I not only got through school, I graduated from college and didn't have any kids along the way. Not to walk around places with my mom who looks white and have people assume I'm her nurse or her servant instead of her child. In my everyday life, to be seen as a Latina knocks me down a couple of pegs. It shouldn't, but it does. As hard as people are working for racial equality, I still think we're a ways away from when we truly can get there. Maybe being seen as an American in America might remedy some of that stuff that happens in my everyday life. I'd like to try and see what happens. I will appreciate so much not being othered. Othering leads to many, 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 many problems. And as we've seen in the past, since forever, that's just how it is. I might be alone in this, and you're free to decide what's best for you. Don't let an old, whitewashed Latina from East LA speak for the millions and millions of people across the country and around the world. Cuídense, familia. Hispanic at the disco.